Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when your heart could flutter, but your parents had already signed the marriage contract while you were still teething. In this journey, we'll peel back the layers of medieval love and marriage, where passion was suspect, and a good match meant aligning property lines. Forget dating apps. Your soulmate was probably selected through a land negotiation. Fall in love with the wrong person? That wasn't just frowned upon, it could be considered a social crime. Join us as we explore an era where love was tightly bound by class, church, and coin. So if you're into drama, arranged marriages, forbidden love, and enough political matchmaking to make reality TV jealous, you've come to the right place. And hey, if this already sounds juicier than your last relationship, be sure to like the video, leave a comment with your favorite historical heartbreak, and hit subscribe, because we're about to dive into the most emotionally repressed period in dating history. In the medieval world, love wasn't on the menu. It was more like the side salad no one ordered. What truly mattered was honor, land, and how many goats your family could parade on wedding day. Emotions? Those were considered dangerous distractions. A nobleman choosing a bride for love was seen as foolish. Why marry someone poor with pretty eyes when you could secure 3 villages and a vineyard? Romance was a luxury only troubadours could afford in their songs, not real people in real castles. Even commoners prioritize practicality. Love doesn't plow the fields or weave the wool. So if you thought your parents disapprove of your Tinder date, imagine a medieval dad screaming, "You want to marry for what? Affection?" While today's couples argue over Netflix passwords, medieval couples were busy signing land contracts before ever holding hands. Get ready, because the deeper we dig into this era, the more we'll realize. Love was optional. Property was forever. If you thought medieval love was already complicated, wait until the church enters the chat. In the Middle Ages, romance didn't just need parental approval, it needed divine clearance. The church wasn't just a building with stained glass, it was the moral GPS of the time, and your love life was firmly in its hands. Love had to serve God first, then maybe your partner, if there was room. Marriage wasn't for happiness, it was a sacred duty. Passion, suspicious, lust, straight to hell. Even married couples had to follow a spiritual schedule. No kissing on Sundays, no hugging during Lent, and forget about getting cozy on holy feast days. In short, loving someone wasn't just a personal affair, it was a religious performance complete with sermons, guilt, and occasional exorcisms. So next time your crush leaves you on red, just be glad you're not being judged by a monk holding a Bible and a list of banned bedroom days. If love was tangled in the chains of faith, then marriage was shackled to social class. In medieval matchmaking, your heart didn't get a vote, your bloodline did. Nobles didn't marry for butterflies in the stomach. They married to merge lands, titles, and occasionally enemies. A wedding could be a declaration of peace, or a fancy way to say, let's not stab each other for the next decade. Meanwhile, peasants weren't swiping for soulmates either. They married for practical reasons. She had a cow, he had a field, true compatibility. Romantic feelings, optional, useful skills, required. Even the church got in on the act, blessing unions that preserve power structures. In this society, love across classes was considered scandalous, impractical, and possibly punishable. In short, who you married said more about your tax bracket than your feelings. Welcome to the feudal version of The Bachelor, where the final rose is a deed to a cabbage patch. Now imagine this. You're a peasant boy with a charming smile, strong arms, and absolutely no land. You fall head over heels for the Lord's daughter, who's been trained since birth to marry someone who owns at least 2 castles in a politically convenient chin. Welcome to Forbidden Love, Medieval Edition. Crossing class lines wasn't romantic, it was suicidal. Loving the wrong person could get you disowned, disgraced, or decapitated. Families guarded bloodlines like royal treasures, and the idea of marrying beneath your status was considered worse than catching the plague. A noble falling for a commoner was gossip material for weeks, unless it ended in a duel, which made it gossip for months. Even among peasants, there were unspoken rules. Some cows were simply out of your league. So next time you feel bad because your crush left you on red, be thankful you didn't get banished for liking someone with the wrong tax bracket. Love at first sight? Not in the Middle Ages, more like engagement before first teeth. In many noble families, wedding deals were sealed before the bride could even walk straight. Baby not even done teething? Perfect time for a betrothal ceremony. Parents would gather, shake hands, sign parchments, and boom. Your lifelong partner is chosen, and you're still drooling on your bib. These child marriage contracts weren't cute family traditions. They were strategic alliances in diapers. The kids, of course, had no say. By the time they turned 13, they were expected to smile at their betrothed like they hadn't just met last Tuesday. And yes, the church had no problem blessing these arrangements as long as both families remembered to tithe. So if you're stressing about dating apps today, just imagine trying to flirt in Latin at age 5 while your future in-laws argue about livestock rights. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't measured by heartbeats. It was calculated in livestock, land, and linen. Enter the magical world of dowries and bride prices. When two families discussed marriage, the first question wasn't, do they love each other? But how many cows are we talking? The bride came with a dowry, money, property, or fancy candlesticks, and the groom's family often paid a bride price, which could range from gold coins to a slightly used donkey. A wealthy bride was basically the medieval equivalent of a loaded USB drive, full of assets and ready to transfer. Negotiating a marriage contract looked more like buying a horse than planning a wedding. Sometimes families even fought over who would keep the best silver forks. And if the bride had no dowry, well, let's just say her dating profile would be labeled emotionally available, financially invisible. In medieval love stories, women were often described as radiant, delicate, and mysterious. In real life, however, they were mostly described as married before lunch without being asked. Women had as much say in choosing a husband as a chicken had in choosing the stew. Marriages were decided by fathers, brothers, uncles, or literally anyone with a beard and a land title. If a woman said no, it was usually interpreted as, how adorable, she's shy. The idea of romantic choice was so foreign that even trying to flirt with someone could lead to punishment or a marriage you didn't see coming. In some cases, a woman's opinion was so irrelevant, she learned about her wedding after the priest did. And if she protested too loudly, well, let's just say the convent was always accepting new members. Welcome to the age of say yes or be blessed into silence. If you thought only women had no say in medieval marriage, surprise, men didn't have much freedom either, especially if you were the eldest son. You weren't allowed to fall in love with the baker's daughter. You were expected to marry someone with enough land to fatten the family pig just by walking through it. Love, irrelevant. Fertility, inheritance, and how many cows her father owns? That's the holy trinity of matchmaking. Even younger sons didn't get off easy. If you weren't destined for church robes, you'd likely get a leftover cousin from a neighboring village. And let's not forget the dreaded line, son, it's time to continue the bloodline. Translation, we've picked a wife, don't mess it up. So the next time you pity Cinderella, remember, her prince probably didn't want that ball either. In a world where love was shackled by duty, fairy tales offered a rare escape, at least on parchment. While real-life peasants were busy marrying whoever owned the adjacent pigsty, stories spoke of princes fighting dragons for true love and maidens swooning in towers. These tales were the medieval version of rom-coms, complete with impossible quests and dramatic sighs. People clung to them like wet laundry on a clothesline, dreaming of a love that wasn't arranged by Aunt Bertha over ale and cheese. Troubadours sang about love at first sight, even if most marriages were more like meh at first glance. Reality smelled like cow dung, but fiction smelled like roses. So even if your spouse had the charm of a turnip, you could still imagine them as your knight in slightly dented armor. After all, hope was free, even if dowries weren't. In medieval times, falling in love was a bit like smuggling forbidden cheese across the kingdom. It might be delicious, but it could get you in serious trouble. Personal affection was seen as a luxury, or worse, a threat to social order. A nobleman who dared to love a commoner? Scandalous. A merchant's daughter refusing to marry the wealthy but balding lord her father chose? Outrageous. Love, when not pre-approved by family and clergy, was labeled selfish, reckless, and borderline heretical. In a society obsessed with obedience and hierarchy, choosing your own partner was like throwing a tomato at the king, bold, juicy, and almost certainly punishable. So if someone claimed to marry for love, people would blink twice, clutch their rosaries, and ask, "But what about the dowry?" It wasn't just about compatibility, it was about keeping lands intact, alliances strong, and emotions strictly off the guest list. And so we wrap up our tour through the first chapter of medieval love, or rather, medieval matchmaking mayhem. If your heart feels a little heavy and your head a little dizzy from all the dowries, contracts, and disapproving priests, you're not alone. Back then, falling in love freely was about as rare as bathing regularly. Most hearts were locked behind family gates, guarded by fathers with ledgers and monks with moral pamphlets. But don't despair. In the next chapter, things get a little more exciting. How did people flirt without breaking commandments or bones? What did courtship look like in a world where winking could be seen as heresy? Stick with us as we uncover the secret art of medieval flirting, a combination of poetry, patience, and the occasional stolen glance across the chicken market. Hit that follow button and prepare to giggle through history's most awkward pickup lines. Welcome to Chapter 2, where things get steamy, or at least poetically awkward. In the medieval era, flirting wasn't about swiping right or reacting to Instagram stories. No, it involved reciting rhymed declarations beneath balconies, stealing glances across feast tables, and sending love tokens that looked suspiciously like stolen socks. Courting was a formal sport, played with flowery words and intense eye contact. Nobles turned into part-time poets, scribbling verses that compared their crushes to roses, angels, and sometimes oddly well-baked bread. But make no mistake, this wasn't casual flirting. There were actual codes of conduct, etiquette, and rules that would make modern dating apps look like the Wild West. So buckle up. From heart-throbbing sonnets to ceremonial chicken gifting, we're diving headfirst into the hilariously stiff world of medieval romance. In an era where dating apps were centuries away, poetry was the go-to weapon of romance. Knights and noblemen composed verses of undying love for ladies they'd never even spoken to, sometimes not even seen. It didn't matter if she lived in the next castle or was the cousin of a rival duke. She was the sunshine of his soul and the moon of his longing. These poems were delivered by trusted squires or slipped discreetly into a maiden's embroidery basket. Of course, not all poets were Shakespeare. Some rhymed love with dove, so often it became medieval cliché. But sincerity mattered more than skill, and nothing said, "I adore you," like a badly written sonnet ending with a doodle of a bleeding heart. This wasn't just sweet talk, it was strategic courtship, backed by rhythm, rhyme, and a sprinkle of desperation. Welcome to the curious world of courtly love, a medieval romance trend that was 90% poetry and 10% heartbreak. In this strange love triangle, a noble knight would fall head over heels for a lady far above his station. Usually married, often untouchable, and definitely uninterested. But that didn't matter. The point wasn't to win her heart, but to worship her from afar, like she was a divine painting in a locked chapel. Knights would write long odes praising her eyebrows, her elbows, even her embroidery skills. Touching her was forbidden, kissing was scandalous, and marriage was completely out of the question. It was love as suffering, romance as spiritual trial. If he was lucky, she might drop a handkerchief. If he was really lucky, she might look at him. Ah, medieval love, the only time friend zoning came with a chivalric code. Forget heart-shaped chocolates or love letters slipped into lockers. In the Middle Ages, true love came wrapped in a handkerchief or a glove, or even a single strand of hair. These were not just accessories, they were declarations of war on the heart. Knights would ride into battle with a lady's scarf tied to their lance, as if it granted them magical protection. Spoiler, it didn't. Ladies, on the other hand, might gift a braid of hair to a man they liked, a medieval way of saying, "Here, have a piece of me, but don't get too excited." These tokens were worn, kissed, sniffed, and in extreme cases, guarded like relics. Some even believed they held real power, like warding off evil or making the recipient more courageous. Today, we ghost each other after 3 texts. Back then, you could launch a lifelong emotional roller coaster with a square of embroidered linen. How romantic and mildly unsanitary. In medieval courts, love wasn't declared with a kiss. It was disguised as a chess game, a poetry reading, or a suspiciously long glance over a goblet of wine. These courtly flirtations were so subtle, they made modern texting look like shouting through a megaphone. A lady might accidentally drop her handkerchief 12 times during tea, each time just a little closer to the knight she fancied. The knight, meanwhile, might respond with an overly dramatic toast to beauty and virtue, while staring only at her. Even walking in the garden became a stage, where 2 hearts tiptoed around propriety like nervous actors. Gossip flowed faster than the wine. Every wink could spark rumors of a secret affair. And don't even get started on the poetry duels, where noblemen battled in verse, all while pretending they were just fans of rhyming. In truth, the entire royal court was one big romantic theater where everyone played their part, and no one admitted they were in love. Subtle? Yes. Silly? Absolutely. Effective? Sometimes. While nobles exchanged silk scarves and recited verses, peasants took a more hands-on approach to love. There was no time for sonnets when the pigs needed feeding and the wheat needed threshing. A farmer's way of saying, "I like you," might be fixing your fence, mending your roof, or helping you carry that absurdly large sack of potatoes. The most romantic gift? Fresh eggs, still warm from the coop. Nothing said devotion like handing someone your best hen's produce with a shy smile. Courtship among peasants was practical, awkward, and weirdly adorable. A gloved handshake was replaced by helping clean the pigsty, and instead of quoting love poetry, he might shout across the field, "Don't fall in the ditch again," which in medieval peasant speak meant "I care." These small acts of service became the rural version of serenading under a window. Less musical, but definitely more useful. In the medieval love playbook, jealousy wasn't a flaw. It was practically a love language. And like everything else in the era, it came with rituals. Suspect your sweetheart is glancing at someone else? Easy. Snip off a lock of their hair while they sleep. Medieval code for "you're mine." Still not convinced? Forbid them from making eye contact with anyone under threat of dramatic size. The more religious folks took it up a notch, staking out pews at church just to see who sat too close to whom. Imagine creeping behind stone columns just to spot a smile shared during Mass. Jealousy, it seems, was less about confrontation and more about silent, mildly theatrical possessiveness. Some lovers even hired friends to casually spy on their partner at the local market. Was it healthy? Not really. Was it entertaining? Oh, absolutely. In an age where privacy didn't exist, jealousy was just another public performance, preferably one with dramatic capes and lots of whispering. If you were a medieval woman and dared to say, "I like you" first, congratulations. You've just committed social heresy. In the eyes of society, a proper lady must wait, flutter her lashes subtly, and hope the man understands her 3 seconds of eye contact at the feast. Taking the initiative? Unthinkable. It was believed that women who pursued love were either witches, scandalous, or, worst of all, too modern in the 1300s. That meant speaking in full sentences. Even passing a note could spark rumors and a trip to the confession booth. So instead, ladies became masters of the silent code, folding a napkin just right, sighing near the window, or brushing hands accidentally for the 5th time, all while pretending none of it meant anything. The pressure to appear passive was immense, and yet many women still found clever ways to bend the rules. Because when you're not allowed to say it, you become very, very good at implying it with style. When words were forbidden and glances too risky, the medieval heart turned to fragrance. Yes, in a world without DMs or emojis, love bloomed through the nose. A sachet of dried lavender slipped into someone's pouch. That meant I'm thinking of you. A hint of rose oil on a scarf? That's basically a perfume-powered love letter. Even sweaty knights got in on the action, dabbing themselves with herbal mixes before tournaments, just in case their lady love happened to be watching, and hopefully downwind. Of course, the real pros created signature scents, a custom blend of mint, sage, and desperation. These olfactory declarations were subtle, romantic, and slightly chaotic, especially when 10 suitors wore the same scent and the wrong guy got the message. Still, for the clever courtier, a well-placed whiff could say more than 100 poems ever could. After all, nothing sparks a medieval crush like a mysterious smell wafting through the banquet hall. If you think love triangles are a modern K-drama invention, think again. Medieval courts were practically their birthplace, with knights swooning over queens, queens secretly in love with poets, and poets married to noble women who had a thing for stable boys. It was a full-blown emotional tournament. Of course, everything was wrapped in layers of polite society. Instead of public screaming matches, you'd get duels for honor. Translation: you flirted with my crush, and now I must poke you with something sharp. Love triangles weren't just personal drama. They were political headaches. A wrong wink at the wrong dinner could spark gossip wars, ruin marriages, and even ignite a tiny civil war. But the best part? Everyone pretended it was about chivalry. Oh no, I didn't stab him because of Lady Isabel. It was about the rules of jousting. Sure, in truth, the Middle Ages didn't invent messy love, but they definitely gave it velvet capes, shining swords, and a flair for dramatic exits. In the medieval arsenal of romance, poetry wasn't just sweet, it was savage. When love faded or betrayal brewed, knights didn't sulk, they rhymed. Spurned lovers would compose verses so dramatic, even Shakespeare would have said, "Whoa, dial it back." These poems were read aloud in taverns, scribbled on chapel doors, or sung by wandering minstrels with zero sense of discretion. Want to win back an ex? Write an ode to their beauty and your eternal suffering. Want to insult your rival? Pen a sonnet comparing their face to a rotting turnip. And the best part? You could deny it all. Me? Write that? No, it must have been divine inspiration. Poetry became the medieval subtweet, public, petty, and gloriously passive-aggressive. Love and vengeance, all wrapped in flowery stanzas and exaggerated metaphors. Because if you couldn't duel for love, you might as well devastate with a quill. And so, as we reach the end of our medieval dating manual, one thing becomes clear. Courtship in the Middle Ages was not for the faint of heart, or the poetry of verse. Whether it was nobles dropping poetic bombs in the banquet hall, peasants offering poultry as flirting, or jealous lovers cutting locks of hair at midnight, every gesture had layers of drama, etiquette, and a sprinkle of passive aggression. Love was a battlefield, but with quills instead of swords, and sighs instead of shouting. To win someone's heart required not just affection, but strategy, patience, and preferably a lute-playing sidekick. It was theatrical, convoluted, and honestly, kind of fabulous. In the end, the art of wooing in medieval times wasn't just about love, it was about playing the game and playing it well. So next time you struggle to write a Tinder bio, be grateful you're not composing 24-stanza odes by candlelight while dodging duels in the garden. Welcome to the medieval wedding industry, where love was optional, but family contracts were non-negotiable. In this era, getting married wasn't about butterflies in the stomach, but gold coins in the dowry chest. Marriage served as a tool for merging lands, sealing alliances, or, let's be honest, solving political awkwardness. Your kingdom just tried to invade mine? Let's marry our kids and pretend that never happened. The bride and groom, mere footnotes. Often, they had never spoken before the wedding, and might not speak much after either. Parents, uncles, bishops, and occasionally the entire royal court were the ones negotiating, as if they were trading livestock, with better clothes. Romantic, right? The result was a wedding that looked like a fairy tale, but functioned like a boardroom meeting, complete with paperwork, signatures, and a strong whiff of obligation. And thus began many a medieval marriage, Not with a kiss, but with a contract. Planning a medieval wedding wasn't just about picking flowers in a playlist. It was a months-long diplomatic operation. First came the dowry negotiations, where both families haggled harder than two merchants over a sick donkey. Then came the priest's calendar, which was mysteriously full every time someone suggested a fun date, because you couldn't marry during Lent, Advent, or basically 200 days of the year. And let's not forget the agricultural schedule, because no one wants a wedding during harvest season when everyone's knee-deep in wheat. Invitations had to be handwritten, usually by someone who barely knew the alphabet. The groom's family prepared the feast, the bride's family prepared their nerves, and everyone else prepared gossip. In short, arranging a wedding wasn't just stressful, it was medieval-level stressful. But hey, at least no one had to worry about DJ playlists. Just a drunk lute player and two goats for backup vocals. A noble wedding in the Middle Ages was less about love and more about logistics and lace. Picture this: a cathedral bursting with velvet, trumpets blaring, feast piled high with roasted peacocks, complete with feathers, and everyone trying to look impressed while sweating under layers of fur. But here's the plot twist. Sometimes the bride wasn't even there. That's right. In a classic case of marriage by proxy, the groom could marry a stand-in, usually a random noble cousin holding a pillow in a dress. The real bride might still be en route from a distant kingdom, stuck in traffic of ox carts. Even when she was present, she often just nodded politely while two bishops and four notaries confirmed she now legally belonged to house whatever. Extravagant? Yes. Romantic? Let's say it looked good in paintings. But beneath the sparkle was a very expensive, very awkward performance, starring two people who may or may not have met before the wedding. While noble weddings flaunted feathers in political deals, peasant weddings had one goal: survive until the ale ran out. Picture a village square with ribbons made from old tunics, a priest slightly tipsy from holy wine, and a bride chewing nervously on garlic, not for nerves, but because it keeps evil spirits and gossipy aunts away. The ceremony, quick and efficient, a blessing, a handshake, and a muttered promise not to argue about who forgot to milk the cow. Then comes the main event, the feast. Tables creak under roasted turnips, questionable stews, and of course, barrels of ale that somehow disappear faster than the groom's nerves. Dances break out, someone plays a lute badly, and by midnight, half the village is barefoot, belting out off-key songs about goats. Romance? Maybe. But in its own sweaty, muddy, slightly chaotic way, a peasant wedding had more heart than all the castles combined. Ah, the dowry. Not just a pile of gold or a bonus cow, but the sacred price tag of medieval romance. In noble circles, the dowry was a deal-maker. No matter how charming the bride or how sharp her cheekbones, without a fat purse or a few acres of farmland attached, she was considered emotionally bankrupt. Families negotiated the dowry like seasoned merchants, often with more passion than the couple themselves. The bigger the dowry, the more eligible the groom. Some ambitious fathers even faked wealth just to marry up their daughters, which occasionally led to awkward situations involving goats, IOUs, and angry in-laws. But the dowry wasn't just a gift, it was the entry ticket to the marriage arena. Without it, a girl could remain single, regardless of her beauty or talents. So in a twisted way, love in the Middle Ages often came with a receipt and sometimes a livestock invoice. In the Middle Ages, the most precious wedding gift a bride could offer wasn't gold, land, or a rare singing goose. It was her chastity. Society treated virginity like a holy relic, and proving it after the wedding night was practically a neighborhood event. Families would appoint witnesses, usually nosy aunts or midwives, to wait outside the bedroom, ready to inspect the bed sheets for evidence of virtue. Sometimes they even held up the sheet for everyone to see, like a bizarre medieval victory flag. If there was no blood, panic. Accusations flew, dowries were recalled, and the bride's honor could be destroyed faster than you could say, "But we just cuddled." The pressure was so absurd that some brides resorted to creative methods, like hiding a small cut on their arm. So while the groom looked forward to love, The bride was terrified of linen. Forget wedding rings. The real horror was the post-wedding sheet audit. If you thought modern wedding traditions were strange, wait until you hear about medieval ones. In some villages, the newlyweds had to place their hands on a loaf of bread while reciting vows, because carbs were apparently sacred. In others, they'd drink mead not from goblets, but from each other's shoes. Yes, nothing says romance like sipping honey wine from a sweaty leather boot. And then there was the bizarre tradition of breaking a cake over the bride's head for luck. Because what better way to start a marriage than with crumbs in your hair? These rituals weren't just eccentric. They were believed to ensure fertility, loyalty, and fewer mother-in-law problems, hopefully. While noble weddings had their grand pageantry, the common folk took pride in their weird and wonderful customs. So next time someone complains about catching the bouquet, remind them it could be worse. They could be chugging from a boot. Getting married in medieval times wasn't just signing a contract. It was standing in front of God, the priest, your entire village, and possibly a goat to promise eternal loyalty. The vows weren't taken lightly. Till death do us part literally meant don't even think about divorce. Breaking a marriage wasn't just scandalous. It was borderline heresy. The church was the supreme wedding planner, making sure every step was as holy as possible. Couples had to say their vows in public, often right outside the church doors so everyone, including gossipy aunts, could witness. Then came the blessing, serious, dramatic, and occasionally interrupted by wandering chickens. It was believed that this divine oversight ensured a lasting union, or at least divine guilt if you ever strayed. So while today's weddings might focus on Instagram aesthetics, medieval ones prioritized heavenly surveillance. If the wedding vows were holy, the party that followed was decidedly not. Medieval wedding feasts were the true test of stamina, spanning several days with endless food, rivers of ale, and more questionable dancing than a village fair. Guests played bizarre games like who can catch the pig fastest or guess the bride's dowry value. Music blared from lutes, drums, and that one cousin who thought he could sing. And when the wine flowed too freely, tensions flared, sometimes over seating arrangements, sometimes over inheritance rumors, and occasionally because someone spilled gravy on grandma's only fancy tunic. Fights broke out, alliances shifted, and by the end, half the guests didn't remember who got married. But hey, that was part of the charm. In the end, medieval wedding parties were where love wasn't just declared. It was tested by alcohol, bad dancing, and potential brawls. Not all weddings in the Middle Ages were celebrated with joy and wine. Some were signed with tears and a forced smile. Many couples didn't choose each other. They were chosen. Especially among nobles, children as young as 7 were betrothed, and some were married before they even lost their baby teeth. The phrase love at first sight didn't apply because many didn't even see their future spouse until the altar. Imagine being 14 in a frilly gown or stiff armor, nervously glancing at someone you've never met who is now legally your forever roommate. Parents would whisper, "It's for the family's future," while the kids wondered, "Is this my future?" Some cried, some froze, and some tried to hide behind the priest. But once the vows were spoken, there was no turning back. Welcome to married life, child edition. While many marriages in medieval times were sealed with a priest's blessing and a lot of awkward eye contact, not everyone went willingly. Some desperate souls tried to escape their fate, literally. Runaway brides weren't just a Hollywood fantasy, they were a medieval reality. Young grooms climbed out of windows, brides rode off with stable boys, and sometimes entire families staged dramatic interventions, turning the wedding into a battlefield of honor, tears, and thrown bread. Others went the more divine route. Claiming sudden religious calling, a would-be bride might suddenly feel destined for the convent, while a groom might decide God had other plans, like joining the monastery to avoid matrimony. Church officials were often dragged in to mediate, but even they couldn't keep up with all the miraculous callings that conveniently appeared right before the wedding. Moral of the story? If love doesn't find a way, medieval creativity surely will. So, after the vows are whispered, the wine is spilled, and the dowry is haggled over like a sack of potatoes. What do we really have? A medieval marriage wasn't so much a union of hearts as it was a business merger, with more incense and fewer lawyers. Behind every veil was a negotiation table. Behind every I do was a family council doing math on cattle, land, and alliances. For many, their life path was carved out the moment they were born, complete with a spouse, estate plan, and the occasional unexpected monastery detour. Love, that was a luxury item, like sugar or clean underwear. Some found it eventually. Others just learned to make do with a companion who didn't snore too loudly. In the end, marriage was less about soulmates and more about social math. But if you were lucky or clever enough to stage a fake holy vision, you might just get the final say in your own love story. Welcome to the mysterious world of medieval bedroom politics, where passion was both sacred and sinful, encouraged and forbidden, often in the same breath. The church had a monopoly on bedroom ethics, and anything beyond, for procreation only, was considered suspicious at best, heretical at worst. Couples had to juggle their desire like medieval tightrope walkers, balancing between divine approval and eternal damnation. Whispering sweet nothings? Acceptable. Thinking about enjoying it too much? Straight to confession. In a time when the mere idea of lust was enough to send you on a guilt trip longer than a pilgrimage to Rome, intimacy became an awkward blend of duty and fear. Yet despite the heavy sermons and the looming threat of sin, people still managed to find moments of tenderness, sometimes even romance, though mostly in the shadows behind thick wooden doors. Because let's face it, humans will always be humans. And not even a monk with a lecture scroll could extinguish the spark of curiosity and desire. If you thought your modern calendar was packed, try being a medieval couple. Thanks to the church's enthusiastic micromanagement of passion, over 200 days a year were declared no-go zones for intimacy. Mondays? Too close to Sunday? Fridays? A day of penance? Lent? Absolutely not. Advent? Don't even think about it. Add saints' days, feast days, fast days, and days ending in our day, and suddenly the only safe time left was that one Tuesday in early June, assuming there wasn't a local plague. The church handed out official do not disturb lists that made bedroom scheduling more stressful than tax season. Confused couples often had to consult their priest before even thinking about holding hands. And if they got it wrong, straight to hell, or worse, public confession. It wasn't about controlling love. It was about controlling souls, one awkward abstinence at a time. Because nothing says romance like a papal decree and a candlelit chart of forbidden dates. In medieval times, lovemaking wasn't just a private affair. It was a holy mission with a calendar attached. Couples didn't just ask, "Are you in the mood?" They asked, "Is today blessed by the church?" Because if you chose the wrong night, congratulations. You just offended God, the saints, and probably your mother-in-law too. According to the sacred calendar, certain days were perfect for procreation, while others were spiritual landmines. And heaven helped the poor souls who indulged during Lent or on a saint's feast day. They could be accused of heresy or worse, end up with a very uncomfortable confession session. Some overly pious folks even tracked celestial alignments to avoid divine wrath in the sheets. It got so ridiculous that some couples would rather roll dice than risk getting it wrong. Because in the Middle Ages, passion wasn't just a spark, it was a calculated risk with eternal consequences. Love might be blind, but the church definitely had its eyes wide open. Ah yes, the noble bedroom, where privacy went to die under layers of velvet. In a medieval noble's home, the bed wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was practically a theater stage. Imagine thick curtains, a dozen candles, hand-embroidered sheets, and two servants quietly folding laundry in the corner while you try to whisper sweet nothings. Private? Not a chance. Aristocrats didn't sleep alone. They were often surrounded by attendants, companions, and even pets. And since beds were expensive and massive, they doubled as meeting spots, business lounges, and sometimes family reunions. Even honeymoon nights were observed, literally. Some noble couples had to consummate their marriage with a priest, or worse, a noble witness, lurking nearby. because nothing says romance like fornicating under supervision. The medieval noble bedroom was luxury wrapped in awkwardness, scented with roses and responsibility. Forget velvet curtains and silk sheets. Welcome to the peasant bedroom, where luxury meant not sharing the blanket with the goat. In a typical medieval peasant home, the entire family slept in one room, often in one bed or a hay pile, with kids, chickens, and sometimes a cow for extra warmth. Privacy, only in your dreams, if you could even sleep with all the snoring and mooing going on. For married couples, nighttime romance became a stealth mission. Whispered sweet nothings had to be timed between pig grunts and baby cries, and heaven forbid the in-laws were sleeping at the foot of the bed that week. Sometimes couples would wait until everyone else dozed off, only to be interrupted by someone needing to pee into the chamber pot nearby. If medieval nobles had to worry about servants watching, peasants had to worry about toddlers poking them in the back mid-action. The peasant bedroom wasn't a love nest. It was a crowded chaos tent with hay in uncomfortable places. In medieval times, marriage came with many expectations. Love wasn't one of them. But producing heirs? Now that was a duty etched into stone. For nobles, having a child, preferably a boy, was like signing a royal insurance policy. For peasants, it meant more hands to work the fields, or at least chase the chickens. And sex? It was seen less as pleasure and more as a sacred obligation. Husbands were expected to fulfill their duty, even if they'd rather sharpen pitchforks than romance. Wives, meanwhile, were advised by priests to endure with grace, preferably on approved days only. Of course, some couples may have found joy in the act, but publicly admitting that was about as scandalous as dancing naked in church. And if a couple failed to conceive, blame often fell squarely on the woman, because clearly medieval sperm never missed. In the eyes of the church, intimacy was divine only if it made babies. Otherwise, it was suspicious at best and sinful at worst. Welcome to marital bliss, now with less pleasure, more pressure. Forget romance guides and late-night talk shows. Medieval couples got their sex education straight from the church. Yes, the same people who banned dancing on Sundays were also eager to give you bedroom advice. But before you get excited, let's clarify. It was less how to please your partner and more how not to anger God. These so-called guides were filled with do's and don'ts, mostly don'ts. Missionary position, acceptable. Anything else? Straight to hell. Frequency? As little as possible, preferably just to make babies. And absolutely never on holy days, feast days, fast days, saint days, or Mondays. Priests would even sneak in reminders during confession. Have you sinned horizontally? It was like having a nosy mother-in-law with a Bible and a guilt complex. While some monks tried to publish manuals on moral relations, they read more like horror stories than helpful advice. In short, the church taught people about sex by teaching them to be afraid of it. And yet, behind every sermon was a couple trying to whisper under the sheets without triggering divine wrath. Ah, passion, brought to you by guilt and Gregorian chants. Contraception in medieval times was like a magical treasure hunt. Everyone whispered about it, no one admitted using it, and the church banned it with divine fury. Despite the bans, rumors of herbs, animal bladders, and mysterious charms spread like wildfire. Aunt Bertha's secret potion? Probably just parsley and hope. Cow intestines used as rudimentary condoms? Uncomfortable, but apparently functional. Of course, none of this was officially approved. The church declared any attempt to prevent procreation as interfering with God's plan, which meant couples had to rely on creativity and folk wisdom. Some women wore amulets shaped like frogs to ward off pregnancy. Others recited chants while hopping backwards at midnight. It was less science and more interpretive dance. Midwives, often the guardians of this forbidden knowledge, passed techniques in hushed tones, like members of a very awkward secret society. But beware, getting caught with a dried herb in your pocket could land you in a fiery sermon or, worse, accused of witchcraft. So while medieval couples tried everything from prayer to parsley, one thing was clear. Avoiding pregnancy meant playing hide and seek with both biology and the bishops. In medieval towns, brothels weren't hidden in shady alleys. They were often right next to the bakery. That's right, prostitution was not only common, it was occasionally licensed by local authorities. Why? Because according to some officials, it was better for men to visit a professional than to seduce the neighbor's wife and end up stabbed with a pitchfork. The church naturally frowned upon such arrangements. Officially. Unofficially, they turned a blind eye, especially if taxes were collected. Brothels had rules. No working on Sundays, no loud moaning during Mass, and definitely no seducing the priests. Many sex workers even wore special colored scarves to mark their profession, like a medieval VIP pass. Of course, this moral compromise came with its own hypocrisy. Men were seen as weak to temptation, while women in the trade were painted as sinners dragging souls to hell with lipstick. And yet, these women kept the town gossip alive, the bar tabs flowing, and the priests praying harder than ever. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where morality was flexible, but only if you had exact change. In the Middle Ages, being gay wasn't just frowned upon, it was a one-way ticket to the Inquisitor's attention. Homosexuality was labeled not only as sin, but as heresy, something so unnatural it apparently made flowers wilt and goats faint. While the church reserved its most passionate sermons for this topic, authorities followed suit with brutal punishments. Caught in a same-sex act, you might face public whipping, branding, or, if unlucky, burning at the stake. Ironically, monastic life was full of men living together, hugging often, sharing beds for warmth. But hey, as long as you said amen after cuddling, it didn't count, right? The hypocrisy didn't stop there. Noblemen with close companions often wrote suspiciously poetic letters, yet nobody questioned them unless they were poor. Meanwhile, two women caught together were dismissed as confused, unless they used tools. Then suddenly it was witchcraft. In a world where desire was tightly regulated, any love outside the one man, one woman, missionary position box was considered a cosmic crime. Medieval logic: fall in love with the wrong person, and suddenly you're both sinners and sorcerers. Adultery in medieval times, a crime so scandalous that punishment depended less on the act itself and more on your plumbing. If a man cheated on his wife, hey, boys will be boys. Maybe a stern look from the priest or a tap on the wrist, assuming he didn't brag too loudly at the tavern. But if a woman strayed, all hell broke loose. Public shaming was the appetizer. Next came parading through the village in nothing but a slip, a bucket of rotten vegetables flying through the air, and sometimes a good old-fashioned public whipping, because nothing says justice like bruises in the market square. There were even special cuckold chairs for humiliated husbands to sulk in. Meanwhile, nobles often got away with secret affairs by tossing a few coins at the right bishop. So while fidelity was technically a virtue, in practice it was more like a suggestion, especially if you had a beard and a title. Moral of the story? In medieval love, your gender decided whether you'd get a slap on the wrist or a slap with a fish in front of the whole town. As the church bells toll and candlelight flickers across damp stone walls, one thing becomes clear. Medieval lust wasn't dead. It just had to hide very well. Desire back then was a paradox. It was sacred and sinful, necessary and forbidden, all at once. People tiptoed through a maze of religious rules, fearing that one wrong move in bed could land their soul in eternal fire. Yet behind those wooden doors, passion still simmered like a cauldron of secrets. Whether through whispered prayers, dubious church-approved loopholes, or good old-fashioned sneaking around, love and lust found ways to survive. Monks secretly scribbled erotic poetry, nobles snuck through castle hallways at night, and even peasants tried their luck between haystacks. The body may have been chained by dogma, but the heart? Oh, it was stubborn. So as this chapter draws to a close, we leave you with a lesson. In the medieval world, love was not just a battlefield. It was a theological minefield with a suspicious amount of hay. Cheating, jealousy, and kitchen stabbing? Welcome to the medieval version of reality TV, except with more blood and less commercial break. In a time when marriages were mostly arranged and love was optional, Extramarital affairs were as common as bad hygiene. But unlike today, a wandering heart could cost you more than just a breakup. It could cost you your hair, your freedom, or even your head. Medieval society treated infidelity like a national crisis. Caught whispering sweet nothings to someone else's spouse? You might get a public flogging. Get caught mid-act? Hope you enjoy a surprise beheading before dessert. Whether you were a nobleman or a peasant, jealousy burned equally hot and often ended with dramatic consequences at the dinner table. So buckle up. This chapter dives into the bloody, scandalous, and wildly hypocritical world of love gone rogue. If you thought your ex was bad, wait till you meet a baron with a broadsword and trust issues. In the medieval courtroom of public shame, women caught cheating weren't just judged. They were turned into walking billboards of humiliation. Unlike their male counterparts, who might get away with a sheepish grin and a wink, women faced the full wrath of moral justice. Common punishments included head shaving, because nothing screams lesson learned like a forced buzz cut, being paraded through town in rags, or worse, bent over a wooden stump in the village square, getting spanked while the crowd cheered like it was festival day. It didn't matter if the affair was real or just a rumor. Society's double standard hit harder than the executioner's belt. Husbands could cheat with the baker's wife and get a pat on the back. But if a wife even smiled too sweetly at the blacksmith, she risked becoming the town's main attraction. The message was loud and clear. Medieval love might be blind, but its punishments were very public and very bald. In the grand theater of medieval double standards, a man caught cheating was less criminal and more oopsie-daisy. While women were shaved, chained, and spanked in public squares, men often got away with a shrug and maybe a lecture if the priest wasn't busy himself. The idea was simple. Men had needs, and as long as they didn't dishonor the family name or spark a scandal with the local barmaid, things were usually swept under the tapestry. Some husbands even justified their affairs as noble pursuits of virility, or worse, research for future heirs. The key rule: keep it discreet, don't humiliate the wife in public, and whatever you do, don't mess with another lord's lady unless you enjoy sword wounds. Ironically, while women were judged by morality, men were judged by subtlety. Medieval society didn't care if you misbehaved, as long as you didn't get caught on a feast day. In the grand halls of medieval justice, when it came to affairs of the heart, facts were optional, but faith, mandatory. Enter the church and its peculiar invention, the court of love. Here, sins of passion were judged not by evidence, but by vibes. Did she look too happy around the blacksmith? Guilty. Did he write a love poem in suspiciously neat handwriting? Off with his dignity. Monks and priests, self-proclaimed experts on chastity, were often the judges, passing verdicts based on divine whispers or stomach instincts. Trials involved testimonies, moral lectures, and sometimes interpretive dance from witnesses. The goal wasn't to find the truth, but to uphold Christian virtue and maybe provide villagers with free entertainment. Love might be blind, but medieval justice was downright imaginative. Forget lipstick stains or suspicious perfume. During the Middle Ages, catching a cheater required far less. If someone saw your spouse chatting too warmly with the baker, scandal. A strange bedsheet found in your home, trial time. Gossip wasn't just a pastime, it was forensic evidence. In fact, one woman was convicted because her neighbor noticed her hair was more windswept than usual in the morning. Clear sign of nocturnal mischief, obviously. The community acted as both jury and surveillance system. You didn't need to hire a detective, just befriend a nosy old widow with good hearing. With standards this low, even whispering too closely at the market might earn you a punishment, or at least a good public shaming. The Middle Ages, where your sheets could testify against you. In medieval times, justice wasn't always blind. Sometimes it wore a chain and walked barefoot through town. One of the most humiliating punishments for adultery was symbolic shaming. Caught cheating? Congratulations, you're now starring in the village parade of disgrace. Offenders were often forced to wear their clothes inside out, symbolizing their inverted morals. Others were chained like dogs and led around the village square, all while the townsfolk jeered, laughed, or, if feeling generous, threw cabbages. The goal wasn't just to punish, but to imprint shame deep into the skin. Even after the walk of shame, some were made to sweep the church floor daily with a toothbrush-sized broom. You could cheat once and mop for eternity. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where fashion crimes were literal and humiliation was community theater. Medieval tabloids would have had a field day with some of the love scandals that rocked noble courts and convents. Take, for example, Lord Gaston, who caught his wife and her dashing young lover mid-pastry and stabbed the poor guy with a dessert fork. Or Sister Magdalene, the pious nun who mysteriously developed a baby bump after meditating, too often in the garden with Brother Pierre. Then there was Sir Roderick, the knight who rode into another lord's estate and declared, "That woman is mine," before riding off with the baron's wife like it was a chivalric supermarket sweep. These stories weren't rare. They were legendary. Some ended in bloodshed, others in exile, and a few even became medieval love songs. If your relationship drama today involves unread texts or awkward family dinners, be grateful. At least no one's challenging you to a sword duel. Yet. In medieval times, love triangles often led to actual triangles, as in you, your rival, and a sharp sword. When jealousy struck, there was no texting angry emojis, only duels. Picture Sir Cedric, who caught his beloved dancing with Sir Roland at the Harvest Festival. Instead of sulking, Cedric slapped Roland with a leather glove and declared, "We settle this at dawn." What followed was less Romeo and Juliet, more Game of Thrones. These duels weren't just personal, they were theatrical. Townsfolk gathered like it was the latest episode of Love and Violence Medieval Edition. The winner got honor, applause, and occasionally a mild stab wound. The loser got, well, buried. The church frowned upon such barbarity, but as long as it happened outside the chapel, most people just brought snacks. Because what better way to settle love disputes than with public sword fighting and dramatically flapping cloaks? Forget subtle suspicion. Medieval husbands had their own brand of catching cheaters, and it involved theatrical flair. The classic trap: pretend to go on a long journey, then return home unexpectedly with a full entourage. Witnesses, drums, even a town crier. Sir Gregor once left for a holy pilgrimage, only to sneak back 2 days later and kick open his door with a dramatic, "Aha!" Inside, he found his wife and the local lute teacher mid-serenade. His friends hiding in the bushes erupted with applause as if it were a surprise party. The whole village got front row seats to the drama, complete with shouting, sobbing, and someone fainting for effect. This wasn't just about catching the act. It was a public spectacle, a medieval reality show. Whether or not true love survived didn't matter. What mattered was catching the act with flair and witnesses. Because nothing says justice like surprise betrayal and a trumpet fanfare. In the romantic minefield of the Middle Ages, falling for someone already spoken for wasn't just frowned upon, it could literally cost you an ear, or a finger, or a one-way trip to exile. Mistresses and lovers who dared dip their toes in forbidden waters often found themselves punished with creative brutality. There's the infamous tale of Alain the baker, who wooed the baron's wife with croissants and bad poetry. When caught, he didn't get a slap on the wrist, he got his left ear sliced off and was paraded around town as a walking love lesson. In some villages, the penalty was exile, but only after a good public whipping and the phrase "thief of hearts" carved into your cloak. And if the lover was from another village, congratulations, they got banned from both towns. The message was clear: love someone else's spouse and you might lose a piece of yourself, literally. In a time where emotions were judged by sword and shame, the price of passion could be painfully permanent. In medieval times, if your parents made a scandalous mistake, congratulations, you just won the grand prize, an unwanted marriage. Yes, in a society obsessed with honor and reputation, the sins of the parents didn't stop with them. Children, especially daughters, often paid the price. Imagine being 14, dreaming of riding ponies or picking herbs, and then, bam, You're married off to the blacksmith's creepy 40-year-old cousin because dad got caught flirting with the miller's wife. This honorable arrangement was meant to patch up broken reputations like some sort of emotional duct tape. And for boys? Well, some got shipped off to monasteries faster than you could say, "I swear I didn't do anything." The logic? If the family loses honor, it must be repaired by tying you to someone else's drama. In the end, being innocent didn't matter. If your last name was tainted, you might as well start practicing your vows or your Gregorian chants. In the Middle Ages, jealousy wasn't just a feeling, it was a potential death sentence. Loving the wrong person could cost you your hair, your home, or your head. A stolen kiss could lead to exile, a suspicious glance, trial by church. And if you were caught red-handed, well, let's just say medieval justice didn't believe in second chances. Love triangles often turned into sword fights, and affairs could escalate into courtroom drama with chains, wigs, and public shaming. But behind all the madness was a society desperately clinging to honor, a fragile concept constantly threatened by the chaos of human desire. In the end, being in love during medieval times was like walking a tightrope over a pit of flaming gossip, armed with only a bouquet of herbs and your best poker face. One wrong step, and you weren't just heartbroken, you were historically humiliated. Forget the roses, forget the lute players. Some medieval romances began not with a glance, but with a paragraph. In dusty libraries and candlelit studies, love was born between ink stains and philosophical footnotes. This was a time when intellectual chemistry could set hearts ablaze, and a well-argued theological point might just win you a secret admirer. Among monks, nuns, scholars, and literate nobles, the written word replaced the flirtatious wink. Instead of, "You have beautiful eyes," it was, "Your treatise on metaphysical ethics stirred something deep in my soul." Passion came in parchment, folded with care, and sealed with wax and longing. Sure, there were no emojis, but medieval love letters had their own flair, exaggerated honorifics, excessive Latin, and an alarming number of biblical metaphors. It wasn't just love, it was a footnoted romance. Welcome to the quieter, quirkier side of courtship, where ideas, not looks, were the real aphrodisiac. In medieval times, if you were a monk with feelings or a noblewoman with a crush, there was no Tinder, only parchment, patience, and poetic passive-aggressiveness. Love letters were the secret tunnel under the fortress of propriety. Especially among scholars, monks, and high-born bookworms, these letters weren't just flirtations. They were masterclasses in emotional restraint disguised as Latin. "My soul yearns for thy wisdom" actually meant, "I think about you every night." From monasteries to manor houses, love snuck into ink bottles and spilled out in metaphors about virtue and the stars. And while delivery wasn't instant, thanks to slow-moving messengers and nosy abbots, the anticipation made every reply feel like a revelation. Some correspondences stretched across decades, building a slow-burn romance with footnotes and theological debate. It was slow, it was subtle, and it was steamy in a very scholastic way. In an age where touching a hand could cause scandal, letters were the love affair's lifeline. Their love began not with a glance, but with a philosophy lecture. Héloïse, a brilliant and bold young scholar, and Abelard, a renowned philosopher with an ego the size of a cathedral, bonded over theology, logic, and the occasional spicy footnote. Their letters were less, "I miss you," and more, "Let's debate free will under divine providence." Of course, the sparks were undeniable, each rebuttal a flirtation, every citation a wink. But love among bookshelves wasn't without risk. When Eloise's uncle found out, Abelard's enthusiasm was permanently curtailed, in a very literal, very painful way. The scandal rocked the scholarly world, a love that defied celibacy, hierarchy, and basic privacy. Banished to separate monasteries, they kept writing, their passion never fading, just better punctuated. Today, their letters survive as timeless symbols of love, built on intellect, ink, and entirely too much ecclesiastical drama. In the Middle Ages, academic letters weren't just for discussing Aristotle. They were also a battlefield of flirty footnotes, Picture this: two scholars debating the nature of existence, but every paragraph has suspiciously poetic metaphors. Your argument on metaphysical dualism is as radiant as a spring morning. Oh, really? One might say it's a scholarly way of saying, I like your mind, and maybe your robes. These debates often escalated into full-blown intellectual courtship rituals, where a rebuttal wasn't just a disagreement, it was foreplay. Quill in hand, hearts pounding, they wrote with passion, wit, and just enough ambiguity to make the monks nervous. In a world where touching hands was scandalous, writing "I respectfully disagree" in elaborate calligraphy might be the boldest romantic gesture of all. In a time when most women were expected to embroider, obey, and marry by 15, a few dared to pick up the quill, and hearts followed. Medieval female writers were as rare as a clean chamber pot, but oh, when they wrote, sparks flew. Their texts weren't just about virtue and piety. Tucked between the lines were subtle declarations of love, sass, and intellectual rebellion. Falling in love through a manuscript was the ultimate plot twist. A nobleman swooning over metaphors, or a monk blushing at a well-phrased critique. These women didn't just defy gender norms, they seduced through syllables. And while society saw them as dangerous distractions, to some lucky readers, they were the true muses of the era. Proof that brains and passion make a dangerously attractive combo. Ah, the forbidden fruit of medieval academia, the student-teacher romance. While the church frowned upon anything that wasn't strictly platonic or painfully dull, sparks still flew across parchment. In noble households, young heirs were assigned private tutors, often handsome, sharp-witted, and unknowingly charming. And in monastic schools where silence was golden, stolen glances and shared inkpots spoke louder than sermons. Of course, this kind of affection was strictly off the curriculum. A whispered compliment on Latin conjugation could turn into blushing ears and daydream-filled lectures. But when minds connect and knowledge flows, it's only a matter of time before hearts get involved. The risks? Oh, everything. From excommunication to forced celibacy. But as history has shown us time and again, when Cupid invades the classroom, no one's grading system is safe. In an age before bookstores and emojis, there was no grander gesture of love than gifting a handwritten manuscript. Forget roses. Nothing said "I adore you" like 200 pages of illuminated Latin poetry wrapped in calfskin. Monks spent weeks copying verses for someone they'd never dare to touch, pouring their feelings into every swirl of ink. Scholars exchanged philosophical treatises like secret love letters, footnotes and all. Some lovers even hid messages in the margins, a medieval version of P.S. I love you. The more elaborate the script, the deeper the feelings. Curlicues weren't just for decoration, they were coded emotions. And let's not forget the heartbreak. If your beloved never returned the manuscript, that was ghosting, 12th century style. But when it worked, oh, that book became a sacred relic, reread until the pages frayed, the ink smudged by fingers that trembled with memory. In the hushed corridors of medieval monasteries, a love that dared not speak its name sometimes whispered through poetry. Same-sex affection among monks or nuns wasn't exactly headline news, unless you counted cryptic verses hidden in prayer books. These were loves born not from lust, but from shared silence, shared scripture, and the aching beauty of forbidden bonds. A simple act, like lingering too long at the candlelit scriptorium or exchanging a knowing glance during Vespers, held the weight of sonnets. Emotions found refuge in handwritten lines of verse, tucked between psalms and copied Aristotle. And if you think monks lacked flair, think again. Some lines could rival Shakespeare in drama. Though the church forbade it, love found its detours through ink, metaphor, and careful punctuation. A misplaced comma could mean scandal, yet even in this cloistered world, affection bloomed like a flower pressing through stone, quiet, unseen, but fiercely alive. She wasn't a noblewoman or a nun, just a baker's daughter with an ink-stained thumb and a secret heartache. Every evening, while the bread was cooling and her parents were counting coins, she would sneak into the attic with a candle and a leather-bound journal. Inside, she poured out her feelings for the knight who once bought 6 loaves and accidentally smiled at her. His name? Unknown. His armor? Shiny. Her obsession? Chronic. For months, she documented every imaginary interaction, dramatic rescues, philosophical conversations, shared pastries by moonlight. Her journal became her sanctuary, her stage, her slow-burn romance. No one ever read it, except maybe the family cat, who sat on it judgmentally. But through those pages, she loved fiercely, freely, and without fear of rejection. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, she found hers, scribbled in the margins between flower smudges and fantasy. Long-distance relationships were hard enough in the Middle Ages. No phones, no Zoom, and certainly no reliable postal service. So when Sir Baldwin marched off on a holy pilgrimage, or what his wife suspected was just a glorified beer tour, Lady Marjorie did what any medieval wife with trust issues and a strong quill would do. She wrote letters, dozens of them, each carefully sealed, perfumed, and packed with passive-aggressive poetry. My love, I hope your prayers are as sincere as your last promise to clean the stables. Meanwhile, Baldwin, camped somewhere between mud and regret, replied with increasingly desperate love notes scribbled on crumpled parchment. Their letters became a lifeline, equal parts longing, sarcasm, and reports about who fed the chickens. In an age when absence didn't make the heart grow fonder so much as paranoid, their ink-stained banter kept their marriage hilariously afloat. In the Middle Ages, when saying goodbye often meant forever, people poured their hearts into letters that tried, valiantly, to substitute for hugs, kisses, and the comforting smell of someone's favorite stew. Take Lady Isabel, whose husband rode off on crusade number whatever. They stopped counting. With each new moon, she sent him a letter folded like origami and soaked in tears, detailing everything from her longing to the cows acting weird. My dearest love, I miss your snore more than the church bell at dawn. In return, her brave, read clueless, knight sent back one letter every 3 months, mostly updates about dust, blisters, and vague mentions of divine purpose. These letters, though uneven in frequency and literary flair, were like lifelines. Some were treasured forever, hidden in chests alongside dried flowers and broken lockets. Because even when war, faith, and fate conspired to keep people apart, ink and parchment still whispered, I love you. Please come back with all your limbs. So, whether you were tucked away in a monastery or lounging in a candlelit castle, the Middle Ages proved one thing loud and clear. Love didn't need eye contact. It just needed decent handwriting and enough parchment. When words had to do all the hugging, kissing, and awkward hand-holding, people got creative. A simple I long for you could be disguised as, may your soul find peace in the divine glow of knowledge. Romantic, right? Sure, knights had swords and ladies had lutes, but the real battlefield was intellectual, fought with ink, ideas, and passive-aggressive postscript notes. For every forbidden crush, repressed scholar, or secret love locked in a drawer full of dusty letters, this was the age when brains met hearts, preferably on vellum. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't just dramatic, it was grammatically correct. And despite all the rules, monasteries, and miles of feudal nonsense, the human heart still managed to sneak in a P.S. or I miss you at the end of a theological essay. Bravo, parchment. You carried more emotions than any knight's armor ever could. Welcome to the Forbidden Chapter, the medieval equivalent of a reality show called Love That Will Get You Excommunicated. In a world where love was supposed to come with a family crest and a papal blessing, falling for the wrong person could get you burned, both emotionally and literally. Did you fancy someone from a lower class? Prepare for dramatic betrayals and family banishment? Crush on your teacher or a married noble? That's not a love story, it's a heresy case. And if your heart beats for someone of the same gender, better hope your love letters aren't intercepted by the local bishop. From monasteries to royal courts, desire was policed harder than heretical pamphlets. This chapter dives into the tales they didn't put in the fairy tales, where love meant sneaking glances in the chapel, secret kisses behind the barn, and praying your passion wouldn't be declared an offense against God. order, or good fashion. Some lovers broke rules. Others broke kingdoms. All of them broke hearts. Buckle up, because this isn't your typical medieval romance. It's the dark, dramatic, and occasionally doomed kind. Once upon a medieval heartbreak, a noble lady fell in love, not with another blue-blooded boor, but with a humble farmhand who smelled like hay and rebellion. In a world where love was supposed to come with land deeds and arranged marriages, daring to love across class lines was as outrageous as showing up to court barefoot. The lady's father, a duke with a mustache as sharp as his social snobbery, nearly choked on his venison when he found out. The poor lad, meanwhile, Berwafgar, was suddenly promoted from man who shovels dung to threat to the family name. Secret meetings in the orchard, whispered poetry over stolen apples. It was all very romantic, until the guards showed up. The affair was discovered, the punishment swift. The girl was sent to a convent to pray the love away, and the boy, let's just say he got a permanent promotion to legend told in sad songs. In medieval times, loving someone from the wrong class wasn't just frowned upon. It was basically treason with a romantic twist, because nothing says I adore you like risking the wrath of an entire noble bloodline. In medieval noble circles, love often came with a shared family tree. Cousins marrying cousins wasn't just accepted, it was practically a family tradition. Keep the bloodline pure, they said, as if genetics weren't busy sharpening their pitchforks in the background. But alas, even in this tangle of titles and awkward family reunions, the church had its limits. If you didn't get papal permission, your wedding could be annulled faster than you could say, House of Habsburg. Many a young lord fell for his cousin, only to be told by a red-robed cardinal that his love life was now excommunicated. And don't get started on the gossip. Medieval rumor mills spun faster than castle laundry day. Was the child a product of love or a slightly too close uncle? That depended on how generous the chronicler was feeling that day. The line between noble romance and holy scandal was razor thin, and sometimes it only took one monk with a quill and too much free time to turn family love into a cautionary tale. Falling in love with a monk in the Middle Ages was like falling for a statue, holy, distant, and guaranteed to ruin your spiritual GPA. Monks and nuns were married to God, which meant any romantic entanglement was essentially divine cheating. But that didn't stop young villagers from getting starry-eyed when Brother Thomas walked by, with his perfectly tonsured haircut and mysterious silence. Some would drop extra loaves of bread near the monastery gate, hoping he'd notice. Others sent anonymous love letters disguised as confessions. If a monk ever reciprocated, scandal, absolute scandal. He could be defrocked, exiled, or worse, forced to do dishes for the entire monastery for a decade. And the girl, branded a temptress, whispered about in every chapel pew. The church took these matters very seriously. Holiness was sacred, and your heart didn't get to pick its own side. Love might be blind, but in this case it also needed earplugs and a vow of silence. Love between a master and a slave in the Middle Ages was the ultimate societal nosebleed. If the lord of the manor fell for the maid scrubbing floors, people didn't call it romance. They called it chaos. Slaves were legally property, so any affection was seen as inappropriate attachment to livestock. Some lords genuinely fell for their servants, offering secret tokens like a ribbon or sneaking glances over roast duck at dinner. But if discovered, the lord risked public humiliation or even losing status, while the servant could be punished for seducing her superior. Yes, seducing from behind a broom. The church was no help either. They just frowned and suggested more prayer. And society? Oh, society lost its collective mind. A noble kissing a servant? Outrageous. What next? A goat joining the royal court? Despite it all, love persisted in broom closets and candlelit kitchens. The heart, it turns out, doesn't read social contracts. Medieval love stories had their share of oddities, but nothing quite matched the romances that crossed the species or botanical boundary. Tales of women falling in love with wolves or knights bewitched by forest spirits shaped like deer weren't just bedtime gossip. They were whispered warnings. And yes, somewhere deep in rural folklore, There was even the story of a lonely woodcutter who married a tree. No, not metaphorically. He claimed the tree spoke to his soul. His neighbors, unsure whether to laugh or bless the union, eventually built them a tiny wooden home with extra mulch. Of course, the church frowned upon these unnatural unions, calling them heresy or lunacy. But deep down, everyone was just curious. Did the tree say "I do" by rustling its leaves? These surreal romances may sound absurd today, but they remind us that even in the strictest societies, love sometimes takes root in the strangest places, literally. In the Middle Ages, love was already dangerous, but falling for someone labeled a witch, that was like signing up for a candlelit barbecue with a one-way ticket. Picture this, a charming healer woman with wild curly hair and a suspiciously effective herbal remedy for everything from warts to heartbreak. Then there's her devoted lover, a local blacksmith who's less interested in God and more in her potions. Their romance was fiery, both metaphorically and literally. Once the villagers noticed the blacksmith getting too cozy around the cauldron, it didn't take long before pitchforks were sharpened. They were dragged to trial, accused of witchcraft and carnal sins. The verdict? Burn first, ask questions later. And so, in a tragic twist worthy of medieval soap opera, the lovers embraced one last time, flames licking at their feet, smoke swirling like a twisted wedding veil. Morale of the story, in medieval romance, mixing love and magic could get you roasted. In an age where the church decided everything from what you ate to who you loved, falling for someone outside the doctrine wasn't just frowned upon, it was fatal. Meet Clara, a young woman with a rebellious soul and a taste for forbidden love. She didn't fall for the village priest or a noble knight, but for Elric, a scholar excommunicated for his radical beliefs that God might actually want people to be happy. Their love was tender, philosophical, and unfortunately, heretical. Once the rumor spread, the church stepped in faster than you could say amen. Accused of blasphemy and corrupting Clara's soul, Elric was sentenced to death. Clara, refusing to renounce their love, faced the same fate. Their final embrace in the town square was not one of despair, but defiance. As the firewood crackled beneath their feet, they smiled. Turns out, in medieval times, love didn't just break hearts, it broke commandments. In the medieval dating world, nothing screamed drama quite like falling in love with someone of the wrong faith. Meet Isabella, a devout Christian merchant's daughter, and Omar, a charming Muslim scholar traveling from Andalusia. Their eyes met at the market stall over a dispute about the price of saffron, and the rest, as they say, was forbidden. The problem? Interfaith love wasn't just frowned upon. It was practically a one-way ticket to excommunication or exile, or both. Despite the whispers, judgmental glances, and a nosy monk who kept trying to convert Omar mid-date, their bond grew stronger. They shared poetry under olive trees, debated theology, awkwardly, and dreamed of a world where love trumped dogma. But eventually reality bit back. Isabella's family tried to marry her off to a nice Christian knight, and Omar got accused of sorcery for carrying a telescope. Spoiler, it didn't end with a happily ever after. But their love story outlived the torches and tribunals. In secret songs passed down by those who still believed love knows no religion. Love stories across battle lines are rare, but when they happen, they hit like a catapult to the heart. Meet William, an English knight whose hobbies include sword fighting and sulking, and Isabel, a French princess with a sharp tongue and sharper aim with a crossbow. Their countries were at war, their flags enemies, but fate had other plans. Specifically, a hostage exchange gone wrong and a secret escape through the forest. That's where the sparks flew, right between ducking arrows and arguing about who smelled worse after 3 days without a bath. Their romance was like a poorly written play, passionate, chaotic, and destined for tragedy. He couldn't take her home without starting another war. She couldn't stay with him without getting disowned. So they settled for passionate letters, a hidden cabin, and the occasional sword fight for foreplay. Their story didn't make it into the official chronicles, probably because neither side wanted to admit their best warrior was sneaking kisses behind enemy lines. But for those who believe in love stronger than borders, William and Isabel remain legends whispered under banners and bed sheets. In the grand opera of medieval politics, love was the rogue soprano that ruined everything. Take King Alaric of the fictional kingdom of Castellan, strong on the battlefield, weak in the heart. His lawful queen, Matilda, was noble, pious, and unfortunately as exciting as boiled cabbage. Then came Elena, the court musician's daughter with eyes like rebellion and lips that whispered revolution. One lute lesson turned into two, and suddenly the king was composing love songs instead of war strategies. He divorced the queen, married Elena, and thought he was writing a new romantic chapter. The nobles, however, were writing something else, a list of reasons to overthrow him. Civil war broke out faster than you could say love triangle, and soon Alaric found himself king of absolutely nothing. Turns out, in the Middle Ages, following your heart could cost you your crown and your head. Moral of the story? If you're a king, think twice before you swap your queen for a bard with a killer smile and a suspiciously sharp harp string. And so we close the scroll on the cursed loves of the Middle Ages, those forbidden romances that burned brighter, crashed harder, and left behind enough drama to make any modern soap opera blush. From nobles falling for peasants to monks sneaking kisses behind cloisters, from witches finding love before the pyre, to kings tossing crowns for forbidden embraces. One truth remains. Medieval hearts were reckless, defiant, and absolutely terrible at risk assessment. But maybe that's what makes these tales so unforgettable. They weren't just love stories. They were declarations of war against society, the church, and often common sense. And while most ended in fire, exile, or headless poetry, they etched themselves into the margins of history. So next time your Tinder date ghosts you, just remember, at least you're not being burned at the stake for loving the wrong person. Yet. In a world where turning 40 meant you'd better start writing your will, the idea of old age romance seemed almost mythical. But let's ask the real question. Did medieval elders get to fall in love, or were they expected to just knit, pray, and wait for the afterlife? With an average life expectancy barely scraping past 50, most people didn't live long enough to retire, let alone flirt at sunset. And even if they did, society had a clear message. Love was for the young, spry, and preferably fertile. But here's the twist. Some elderly folks defied the script. Between creaky knees and missing teeth, they found companionship, wrote cheesy poems, and even, brace yourself, remarried. Sure, it wasn't the Romeo and Juliet kind of passion, but it had warmth, wisdom, and way fewer sword fights. So while bards sang about youthful love and tragic beauty, these old hearts just kept beating quietly, stubbornly, and sometimes sneakily. Because no matter how many candles are on the cake, or how few teeth are left, love doesn't check IDs. In the medieval world, growing old often meant outliving your spouse, and then being expected to outlive your emotions too. Widows and widowers who dared to fall in love again faced raised eyebrows sharper than a knight's sword. Society whispered behind their backs, "Isn't she too old for romance?" Or, "Isn't he just looking for a cook?" Remarrying after a certain age wasn't seen as hopeful. It was scandalous. A widow seeking a second chance at love could be labeled greedy, desperate, or worse. Unholy. Yet many did it anyway, because after burying a loved one, who wouldn't crave a warm hand to hold during cold winters? Love didn't retire just because your back hurt or your eyesight faded. And while the world chuckled or judged, some elders quietly exchanged rings and sometimes false teeth with surprising passion. So yes, in a society full of judgmental neighbors and even more judgmental priests, loving again after loss was an act of quiet rebellion, and honestly, a very brave one. When your children are finally grown, married, and busy yelling at their own kids, you might think, finally some peace. But for some medieval parents, this was also the moment love decided to knock again, this time with gray hair and aching knees. Falling in love in your twilight years, especially after raising a family, was both a blessing and a social minefield. Remarriage wasn't just about companionship, it was a declaration. Yes, I'm still human. Yes, I still want to laugh with someone over burnt stew. Yet tongues wagged. Grown-up children might not take kindly to a new parental figure threatening inheritance or rearranging the kitchen. Villagers might raise their eyebrows so high they disappear into their hairlines. Still, for those brave enough to love again, the reward was a kind of romance far deeper than youthful infatuation. Less fire, more ember. A quiet companionship that didn't need fanfare, just a shared bench, a warm fire, and maybe a few sarcastic remarks about back pain. Medieval love at this age wasn't a rebellion. It was resilience wrapped in a wool blanket. In medieval villages, when an old man suddenly married a much younger woman, it wasn't always about love, or at least not the romantic kind. The local gossip would fly faster than an arrow in a joust. "He must be rich," they'd whisper, or "She's clearly after his goats." The reality? Often a mix of survival and strategy. The elderly groom might have needed a caretaker more than a soulmate. After all, who else would warm his soup, remind him where he put his sandals, or chase off nosy neighbors with a broom? For the young bride, marrying an older man sometimes meant a guaranteed roof over her head, a field to tend, and, if she was lucky, a husband who went to bed at 7 p.m. sharp. Some called it gold digging, others called it gold surviving. Was it love? Sometimes. Other times, it was a mutual agreement. She brought youth and energy, he brought land, and a surprising ability to snore through thunderstorms. In any case, their wedding always came with a bonus gift: endless unsolicited advice from everyone in the village. Now let's flip the script. What happens when a wrinkled widow dares to fall for a young, muscular farmhand? Well, in the Middle Ages, that wasn't just rare, it was scandalous. The entire village would practically explode with gossip. "She's bewitched him," the baker's wife would hiss. "He's after her goats," the blacksmith would grunt. In truth, maybe he just liked her storytelling or the way she made stew. But good luck convincing anyone of that. Older women were expected to fade quietly into the background, not go around giggling with handsome lads while picking herbs. If caught, the poor widow risked more than whispers, sometimes even public shame rituals like being paraded with a turnip on her head. Yes, that actually happened. Still, some brave souls chose love over judgment. They knew they were trading village approval for stolen moments of laughter, shared bread, and maybe even a kiss under the apple tree. Was it worth it? Only they could say. But one thing was certain: when Grandma got her groove back in the Middle Ages, the entire parish knew about it. In the twilight of life, not everyone wants a wedding feast or church bells. Some simply want someone to share their soup with. In the Middle Ages, there were couples, yes, old couples, who skipped the official paperwork and just lived together. No priest, no rings, no medieval version of Facebook status updates. They just woke up next to each other, divided chores, and argued over who snored louder. These unmarried companions often became each other's family when all others had passed. Villagers would gossip at first. They lived together, without a vow. But over time, even the nosy miller's wife had to admit it was kind of sweet, especially when he brought her wildflowers or she saved him the last piece of bread. It wasn't romance in poems or songs, but in routine, warmth, and familiarity. And perhaps that's what real love looks like after all the fireworks fade. Just two souls quietly holding on to each other against the ticking of time and the creaks of old joints. In the Middle Ages, declarations of love didn't come with roses or cheesy ballads. No, real love showed up with a bowl of hot porridge and a clean rag. When one got sick, the other became doctor, nurse, cook, and occasional pillow fluffer. Elderly couples who had survived wars, famines, and possibly the plague now faced their final battles. Creaky joints, mysterious fevers, and the daily puzzle of where they left their wooden teeth. Yet their affection didn't fade. She tucked him in when his back gave out from chopping firewood. He held her hand through coughs that wouldn't quit. They argued about garlic in the soup, but never skipped dinner together. And when words failed, a gentle pat on the arm said more than any sonnet. Love at this age wasn't fireworks. It was warm broth, shared silence, and knowing someone would still scratch your back when the itch is in that unreachable spot. Because in the end, what's more romantic than someone who still remembers how you like your porridge after 30 winters together? Jealousy in old age was like a rusty sword, slower to swing, but still sharp enough to cut. In the quiet corners of medieval villages, where gossip spread faster than fleas, old couples had their own brand of possessiveness. He might not storm off in rage, but he'd grumble for 3 days if she gave the blacksmith an extra apple. She wouldn't throw a fit, but her soup might mysteriously lack salt after catching him chatting too long with the widow from the well. Their quarrels didn't come with shouting matches, but with prolonged silences and suspiciously loud yawns. Still, under all that aged patience was the same flicker of insecurity that plagued lovers at any age. Because even when your beard is white and your joints creak like haunted doors, the heart still gets jealous and oddly competitive, especially when the village priest compliments your partner's new linen hood just a little too enthusiastically. It wasn't dramatic like young love. It was pettier, funnier, and somehow more endearing. Because in the end, if no one's fighting over your attention, are you really still in love? Love between two elderly widows in medieval times didn't start with a serenade under a balcony. It usually began at the village church, the local tavern, or while pulling weeds side by side in a garden. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. "You like radishes?" she'd ask. "Only if you plant them," he'd grin. That was flirting, medieval style. Sometimes it started over shared pews during Mass, a quiet nod, and then months of shy glances during sermons. Other times, it happened after 3 ales too many at the tavern, when she beat him at dice and he declared her the most cunning woman he'd ever lost money to. And often it blossomed in silence. Two lonely souls hoeing rows, exchanging stories of lost spouses and sore joints. No fireworks, no love letters. Just a slow-growing companionship rooted in shared grief and new laughter. They didn't look for youthful sparks. They looked for someone who understood why knees creak when it rains. And when that kind of love arrived, it wasn't flashy, but it lasted longer than many feasts and far outlived most troubadour songs. In medieval literature, love stories were all about dashing young knights and blushing maidens. If you were over 40, congratulations. You were officially invisible to poets. Gray hair, wrinkles, not romantic enough. Despite the fact that elderly people fell in love, bickered, and sometimes even snuck out to meet behind the chicken coop, storytellers acted like they turned into furniture. Old lovers rarely made it into ballads unless they were tragic, cursed, or dead. Meanwhile, real life was full of elderly couples gossiping, giggling, and holding hands like teenagers with arthritis. But try pitching that to a medieval bard and he'd fall asleep mid-lute strum. The irony? The most enduring love stories were often the ones lived quietly by older couples, without dragons, duels, or damsels in distress. Just two people, one cup of soup, and the willingness to share a blanket. But alas, that didn't sell scrolls. So, history's most tender romances were left out of the manuscripts, replaced by tales where everyone was young, beautiful, and allergic to commitment past the age of 30. In the golden hour of life, love doesn't come with grand gestures or wedding bells. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet bench, a warm hand, and someone who listens without interrupting your complaints about back pain. For many elders in the Middle Ages, loneliness wasn't poetic. It was just plain boring. No parties, no pillow talk, just goats, arthritis, and the same soup every day. Marriage, too complicated. A legal mess with inheritance and nosy relatives. What they truly longed for was not a spouse, but a companion. Someone to pass the dusk with, to watch the chickens together and argue whether it would rain. A shared smile while feeding ducks could mean more than a church vow. And while poets ignored these mundane romances, they were quietly written in the lines around the eyes and the way two wrinkled hands found each other without needing to explain a thing. And so, we arrive at the quiet finale of this tale, where love, stripped of drama and declarations, becomes a warm presence rather than a blazing fire. In the twilight years of life, romance no longer gallops in like a knight on horseback. It strolls in slowly, carrying a cane and a bag of herbs for your aching joints. There are no serenades under windows, just quiet humming while tending the garden together. No more frantic letters, only knowing glances across the dinner table. Love at this age doesn't demand, it simply stays. It holds your hand when you forget where you left your slippers. It nods patiently when you retell the same story for the third time. It's not about grand passion anymore, but about quiet endurance. Like the golden sun resting over an old wheat field, it's not blinding, it's beautiful. And in that final light, love isn't any less. It's just matured, and perhaps it's never been more real. Welcome to the chapter where love meets its most medieval ending. Death. In an age where reaching your 40s was practically considered elderly, romance didn't always get the luxury of a peaceful breakup or a dramatic walkout. Instead, one moment you're sharing bread under the moonlight, and the next you're sharing it with a ghost. Plagues, wars, bandits, bad soup. It didn't take much for Cupid's arrow to get replaced by the Grim Reaper's scythe. People didn't ask, how did it end? They asked, how long did it last before death interfered? And yet, even in this constant dance with mortality, love bloomed fiercely, perhaps because it had to race against time. There was no forever, only for as long as we both shall breathe, which in medieval math could mean a very short courtship indeed. So yes, love stories back then often ended with a tombstone instead of a see you never. But maybe that made them burn brighter. After all, nothing screams romantic urgency like knowing your next sneeze could be fatal. Saying goodbye in the Middle Ages wasn't as simple as rest in peace. It involved a full-on production. When a lover passed away, funerals weren't just sad, they were theatrical. The procession featured mourners dressed in black, a priest chanting Latin verses no one understood, and someone inevitably fainting for dramatic effect. But here's the twist. Crying was sometimes frowned upon. Yes, you heard that right. According to medieval superstition, tears might trap the soul, keeping it from ascending peacefully. So if you dared weep over your lost love, an old nun would likely appear from nowhere and shush you with holy water. Still, the living found clever loopholes. No crying? Fine, we'll sob in the latrine. No wailing at the altar? Great, we'll bury our grief in song lyrics or passive-aggressive embroidery. Love in the Middle Ages didn't get a happy ending, but it sure got a very dramatic farewell, with candles, incense, awkward silences, and enough emotional repression to fuel an opera. In the medieval dating game, widows and widowers didn't exactly get a second chance at love, especially if they were noble. Imagine losing the love of your life and being told, "Congrats, you're now married to solitude." Noble women in particular faced an emotional iron cage. Remarrying was often seen as scandalous, greedy, or, gasp, romantic. To maintain the family's honor and land, some were locked away in convents faster than you could say, inheritance dispute. And noblemen, well, they usually got a second, younger wife before the funeral candles went out. Meanwhile, common folks had it slightly easier, unless their in-laws had opinions louder than church bells. Some widows quietly lived in their memories. Others wrote bad poetry in the margins of prayer books, and a few brave souls dared to flirt again, with the subtlety of a potato sack. Life went on, but not always with permission. In the Middle Ages, being a widow wasn't just a social status. It was a full-time emotional job. In the Middle Ages, if you truly loved someone, you didn't just serenade them under a window. You wrote them into your will. Forget flowers and chocolates. The most romantic gesture of the time was gifting a goat, a corner of farmland, or a rusty sword with sentimental value. Nobles took it up a notch by bequeathing entire manors or secret love poems hidden behind religious texts. It wasn't just about property, it was about legacy. To my beloved, I leave this cursed dagger in half my vineyard. May you drink and remember me fondly. Of course, things got messy when the family found out. Nothing screams romance like your widow being sued by your cousin for stealing the gifted chicken coop. But hey, medieval love was never simple. These final tokens were the era's version of texting, "I'll always love you," only legally binding and accompanied by a wax seal. It was love from beyond the grave, administratively approved and emotionally chaotic. Love doesn't always die with the body. In medieval times, many people kept their departed partners alive through surprisingly effective methods, like talking to their pillow as if it were their spouse, awkward during dinner guests, or wearing the same cloak their lover gifted them every day for decades. Some even refused to wash the lover's final letter, even if it got dunked in soup. The most dramatic? A woman who kept her husband's boots by the door for 20 years in case he comes back. Spoiler, he didn't. These mementos, habits, and ghostly traditions weren't just about grief. They were acts of devotion, clinging to memory like a medieval Facebook post that never gets archived. Even when neighbors whispered and priests raised eyebrows, these small rituals helped people feel a bit less alone. Because in a world where plagues and wars could snatch your soulmate overnight, keeping a piece of them, even if it's a moldy hat, was the only way to say, "You're still here." In medieval times, if you wanted a divorce, you'd better be friends with a bishop, a saint, or at least a miracle. Because breaking up wasn't just hard, it was practically illegal. Marriage was seen as sacred, permanent, and annoyingly indestructible. Even if your spouse snored like a warhorse or smelled like a stable, you were expected to smile and say, "Till death do us part." But what if love turned into loathing? Some couples tried the holy route, pleading to the church for an annulment, which only worked if you could prove your spouse was actually your cousin or a goat. Otherwise, tough luck. The best most people could hope for was to live in separate huts and pretend the other had died in a farming accident. The church held the keys to your romantic freedom, and they weren't handing them out like candy. So while modern couples debate splitting the couch, medieval ones debated whether building a fake monastery and hiding there was worth the risk. Spoiler, it usually wasn't. When divorce was a fantasy and annulment a miracle, some medieval folks took matters into their own hands by running away. Yes, if your spouse snored louder than a cathedral bell or lectured like a monk on wine, escape became oddly romantic. Some disguised themselves as peasants and fled to another village, hoping no one would notice the sudden loss of a particularly loud noblewoman. Others joined monasteries not for faith, but for freedom, because nothing says "I need space" like shaving your head and vowing silence. One daring tailor even dressed as a nun for 2 years before his ex found out, at Easter Mass. Of course, getting caught meant public humiliation, or worse, forced reconciliation. But for many, the thrill of freedom was worth the risk of excommunication. So if you ever feel trapped in a relationship, just remember, at least you don't have to fake a pilgrimage to escape your in-laws. In the age of knights and plagues, forbidden love didn't just lead to broken hearts. It sometimes ended in dramatic tragedy. Star-crossed lovers who couldn't get the church's blessing had very few options. Either sneak around like poorly trained spies, or, in the most extreme cases, take the Romeo and Juliet route. Of course, the church had a strong opinion. Suicide was a sin, and you were practically promised the worst seats in the afterlife. But that didn't stop desperate lovers from leaving behind tear-stained letters, poetic declarations, or, most tragically, a matching pair of shoes by the riverbank. Tales spread of noble ladies leaping from towers, or shepherds vanishing into the mist after being denied their true love. It was the medieval version of a breakup playlist, except it involved actual death and maybe a curse or two. Even then, some viewed these acts as proof of eternal love, while the church scrambled to invent a better sermon about healthy emotional coping. Some people move on, some don't. And then there's that one person in the village who turns down every matchmaking attempt with the same line, "No one can replace my dear Edwina." In medieval times, losing a loved one could mean the end of your romantic life forever. Whether out of loyalty, grief, or the sheer exhaustion of starting over, some chose to close their heart like a rusty drawbridge. These individuals became local legends, the baker who baked alone for 50 years, or the knight who polished a locket daily instead of his armor. Friends would whisper, "He still sets a second plate at dinner." Was it tragic? A bit. Was it romantic? Definitely. Was it also a very convenient way to avoid dating disasters? Absolutely. While others danced at the spring festival, they sat on the sidelines clutching memories tighter than their purse strings. In a world of uncertainty, one truth remained. True love never dies, unless you're being chased by a wild boar, in which case it dies quite suddenly. Some medieval romances didn't end with death. They just got spooky. Folk tales whispered of lovers who returned from the grave, not to haunt, but to hug. Ghostly exes made surprise appearances, leaning on the bedpost, sighing dramatically in dreams, or knocking over candles in passive-aggressive fashion. Villagers claimed to hear mournful ballads at midnight or saw figures in white weeping near the riverbank. Definitely not just a sleep-deprived shepherd with a blanket. Some believed that unresolved love had enough power to bridge the gap between the living and the dearly departed. One famous tale told of Lady Elspeth, who dreamed nightly of her late fiancé whispering sweet nothings, until her new suitor got slapped by an invisible hand. Coincidence? Probably. But did it stop the wedding? Absolutely. These tales weren't just ghost stories. They were heartaches wrapped in fog. In a time without therapy, closure came via spectral visits and cryptic dreams. So if your candle suddenly goes out or your soup tastes weird, don't panic. It might just be love from the other side. In the Middle Ages, when your husband marched off to war, you had two choices: wait or wait with embroidery. Many women became accidental experts in patience, holding on to hope like it was a family heirloom. Days turned into months, seasons blurred, and every knock on the door was a potential plot twist. Either a letter, a ghostly rumor, or a basket of potatoes. There was always that distant cousin who'd whisper, "He's probably married a peasant girl in Normandy by now." But no, our heroine believed. She lit a candle each night, kept his armor polished, just in case, and glared at anyone who dared mention moving on. Some husbands did return, usually missing a tooth, a leg, or a personality, but for others, only silence came home. These stories weren't just tales of absence. They were testaments to stubborn devotion. Because in a world full of mud, arrows, and plague, the strongest thing you could wear wasn't chainmail. It was denial laced with undying love. In the Middle Ages, love didn't always end with a fight or a dramatic goodbye. It often ended with a plague, a sword, or just bad hygiene. When Cupid shot his arrows back then, death was usually not far behind, giggling in the shadows. But here's the kicker. For many, that wasn't the end. Love, it turned out, had better survival skills than most knights. It clung to old letters, lived in inherited rings, and haunted the favorite bench under the castle tree. Even when one heart stopped beating, the other stubbornly kept dancing to the same emotional playlist. Sure, medieval life was full of mud, war, and fleas, but when people truly loved, they didn't just move on. They built altars of memory, lit candles of hope, and sometimes argued with ghosts in their dreams. Because in a world where you could lose everything overnight, the one thing you refused to bury was love. So here's a question. Did medieval love disappear with castles and plagues, or is it still lurking under modern disguises, wearing skinny jeans and texting you up? The truth is, love in the Middle Ages, despite being shackled by religion, war, and awful dental hygiene, left behind a legacy richer than a royal dowry. Their poems echo in today's ballads. Their tragedies inspire Netflix dramas, and their awkward courtships live on in first date small talk. Sure, no one's jousting for your honor anymore, unless it's on Twitter. But deep down, we're still playing the same emotional games. From silent longing to dramatic sacrifice, from forbidden kisses to awkward family dinners, medieval love taught us one timeless lesson. Love survives, even when laws change, fashions fade, and emojis replace handwritten letters. What the heart wants hasn't changed much. So no, medieval love isn't gone. It's just upgraded to 5G. Before there was Netflix and chill, there was parchment and tragedy. The love stories of medieval Europe didn't just make hearts flutter, they practically laid the foundation for all romantic literature today. Think about it. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. These folks were the original drama queens. Forbidden love, betrayal, passion, tragic endings. Sounds like the average modern K-drama, right? But instead of texting, "I miss you," they wrote entire epic poems that took years to finish and probably killed a few trees in the process. These tales weren't just entertainment, they shaped how we define romance: noble, self-sacrificing, and usually doomed. Even Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a spiritual cousin to these medieval messes. So next time you cry over a fictional breakup, just know, it's medieval literature whispering from the grave, "I started it." If you think the bad boy with a tragic past trope is a modern invention, think again. Medieval courtly love practically invented him. Picture this: a brooding knight with tousled hair, poetic angst, and a haunted stare falls madly in love with a lady he absolutely cannot have, because she's married to his king, of course. He writes her sonnets, fights dragons for her honor, and sighs dramatically under her window at midnight. Sound familiar? That's because this formula has never gone out of style. From K-dramas to Wattpad stories, the essence of courtly love lives on. Only now the dragons are emotional baggage, and the armor is replaced with leather jackets. But the core remains: unrequited devotion, forbidden feelings, and enough yearning to power an entire medieval village. Turns out, heartache is timeless, and quite marketable. Ever wonder where our obsession with fairy tale weddings came from? Surprise, it's not Disney, it's the Middle Ages. Back then, if your wedding didn't involve a castle, a white horse, and a banquet big enough to feed a small kingdom, were you even really in love? Royal weddings set the bar, the bride in a lace-trimmed gown that cost more than a village, the groom trying not to faint under 40 kilos of velvet, and guests judging every outfit like it's a medieval Met Gala. Fast forward to today, and we're still trying to recreate that vibe, just with drones, LED lights, and a photographer named Kevin. From flower crowns to choreographed entrances, our dream wedding checklist is basically a medieval Pinterest board. Turns out the only thing more durable than true love is the pressure to make it Instagrammable. In the Middle Ages, marriages weren't sealed with kisses, but with contracts in between kingdoms, dukes, and the occasional uncle trying to score a trade deal. Love was optional, but alliances? Non-negotiable. Fast forward to today, and while the castles have turned into penthouses and horses into Lamborghinis, the strategy remains the same. Enter the celebrity marriage. It's not House Lancaster weds House York anymore. It's pop star marries footballer, or influencer ties the knot with billionaire heir. The goal? Publicity, brand deals, and a baby with 2 million followers before it can walk. Sure, now they kiss for the cameras, but don't be fooled. It's still politics in a prettier dress. Whether it's medieval diplomacy or red carpet romance, one thing hasn't changed. Love might be blind, but marriage often wears designer shades and signs an NDA. Back in medieval times, a woman's worth was often measured by her unopened packaging. Virginity wasn't just a moral ideal, it was currency. Locked chastity belts, public shaming, and even tests involving white sheets were all part of the control package. Fast forward to today, the belts are gone, but the judgment still going strong. Now it's cloaked in phrases like good girl energy, body count, or endless debates on what's too revealing. Society may have swapped the cathedral for the comment section, but the obsession remains. Whether it's sermons or social media, the pressure on women's bodies to represent family honor, moral superiority, or personal discipline hasn't really left. We just upgraded from parchment scrolls to Instagram DMs. So next time someone talks about traditional values, remember, some traditions were never that valuable to begin with. In medieval times, a bride's family didn't just cry at the wedding, they also cried over the dowry. A successful marriage wasn't built on love, but on how many cows, acres, or shiny goblets the bride could bring to the table. Fast forward to today, and while nobody's offering goats anymore, hopefully, the concept has simply evolved. Now it's, does he own a house? Is there a car? And what's your salary again? Dowries have transformed into wedding gifts, prenups, and Facebook posts comparing engagement rings like Pokemon cards. The pressure hasn't disappeared, it just learned to wear a suit and tie. Whether it's a castle or a condo, the negotiation remains. So when someone sighs and says, love should be simple, feel free to respond, sure, just as soon as we finish the credit check. Back in the medieval days, falling in love with the wrong person could cost you a lot more than just heartbreak. It might land you in a dungeon, a nunnery, or worse, married to your cousin. Forbidden love was the ultimate drama, complete with torches, taboos, and tragic endings. Fast forward to today, and while we've upgraded from castles to condos, some loves are still considered off-limits. But here's the twist. Those same forbidden romances of old have become the inspiration behind modern love revolutions. Today's fight for LGBTQ+ rights, intercultural relationships, and even online dating freedom echoes those ancient cries of, let me love who I choose. It turns out Romeo and Juliet weren't just star-crossed, they were ahead of their time. So the next time you swipe right on someone your grandma disapproves of, just remember, you're not rebelling. You're honoring a long tradition of love against the odds. Back in the medieval days, a woman choosing her own husband was as rare as a dragon sighting. Legendary, but probably not happening. Marriages were often arranged like trade deals, and romantic feelings optional. The bride's opinion was usually the last thing on the list, right after the number of goats in her dowry. Fast forward to today, and while women have more freedom to choose their partners, the ghosts of arranged matches still linger. From family pressure to societal expectations, many women still find themselves fighting for the basic right to say, I choose him, not you, not Aunt Linda, me. It's a love story still being written, one where independence is the main plot twist. So next time someone questions your taste in partners, channel your inner medieval rebel queen and remind them, choosing your own love is not a phase. It's a revolution, centuries in the making. Even after centuries, medieval love still tugs at our heartstrings like a lute in the hands of a heartbroken bard. Whether it was a knight writing poetry under a candlelit window or a peasant couple secretly exchanging bread crusts behind the barn, love back then had intensity and calories. The joys of sneaking a smile, the pain of forbidden touches, and the sacrifices made in the name of love are all too familiar even today. It's that bittersweet ache we feel when watching a period drama and yelling, just kiss already, as hit the screen. Medieval love didn't fade, it evolved. It seeped into songs, poems, films, and yes, even cheesy wedding hashtags. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by modern love's chaos, take a deep breath, light a candle, preferably not in a hay-filled barn, and remember the emotional blueprint was drawn long ago, with ink, tears, and the occasional sword duel. Love has always been a battlefield. Just ask any medieval bard caught in a triangle between a duchess and her disapproving father. Back then, your heart said yes, but the church, the village, and your family council of 5 said a firm, absolutely not. Fast forward to today, and surprise, the battlefield's still here, just updated with dating apps and opinionated group chats. The eternal tug of war between heart and head, between what you want and what you're told to want, remains unchanged. Whether it's a knight torn between duty and desire, or a modern soul wondering if swiping right will bring true love or just another therapy bill, this conflict keeps romance deliciously chaotic. And perhaps that's the true magic. Love, in all its messy contradictions, is timeless. The more things change, the more our hearts stay wonderfully confused. And just like that, our journey through medieval love comes to an end, filled with forbidden romances, political weddings, noble tears, and way too many dowries. But if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're now emotionally qualified to survive both a castle marriage and a modern relationship. Whether you dream of a fairy tale wedding or just want someone who won't ghost you after 3 texts, remember, love, in all its awkward, poetic, and chaotic forms, has always been part of what makes us human. So thank you for joining us in this time-traveling tale of passion and absurdity. Like the video, leave a comment if you've ever loved like a medieval bard, and don't forget to subscribe. More tales from history's strangest corners await.